And as y'all know, we're in the Gospel of Matthew. We finished up chapter 13 last week. I was going to start chapter 14. Didn't quite make it, so we'll plow into that this morning and try to make our way at least a little ways through chapter 14. We find ourselves in the middle of Jesus' ministry, and as he's been going from place to place, and as y'all remember at the end of chapter 13, he went to his hometown where he grew up, and the Bible talks about, and here in the last couple of verses it said that they were offended in him there because they had said, this is Jesus, he grew up here, this is the carpenter's son, his brothers and sisters are here, there's his mother right there that you can see. You know, where did he get all of this wisdom? Where did he get all of this knowledge? And implied, not stated here, I think, is what gives him the right to tell us how to do things when he's one of us and he grew up right here with us. I think that's kind of what they're insinuating there. And it says there at the end of this that he did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief. And we referenced last week the fact that even for us that are Christians, sometimes it's easy for us to become so familiar and so comfortable with the things of God and the routine of it all that we forget a lot of times to be reverent and to be genuine, I guess is probably the best term. We tend to go through the motions a lot of times without our heart actually being in some of the things that we do. Because ultimately, and of course, the heart will tell on itself. Ultimately, it comes down to motives. Why do we do what we do? Do we do what we do so that other men will praise us? Do we do what we do because it makes us feel better? What's the motivation behind doing what we do? And of course, one of the telltale signs, and if you hang around us church folks any length of time, you'll have experienced this, but one of the telltale signs, if you do something and then you get aggravated or angry or upset when nobody tells you thank you or appreciates it or claps for you or says, gives you praise or for a pat on the back, that kind of thing, then just mark it down. That was your motivation. Okay, it's pretty obvious that now that you're upset, and again, I know that y'all have probably never heard of this happening anywhere around, but that's a telltale sign that the motivation was wrong to begin with. And just like Jesus in the Beatitudes talked about the fact in the Sermon on the Mount, not the Beatitudes, but the Sermon on the Mount, when he talked about the fact that those that pray loudly to be heard, those that give offerings to be seen, those that do all of these things, just understand, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed your pat on the back because that's all you got coming. There's no lasting gifts or anything coming from God for that, because your motivation and your heart was about you getting recognition and you getting some kind of a pat on the back or praise for it, not him. It's those that do things that nobody ever knows or understands, and they do it out of a heart of love for God, that God recognizes that they're doing it for him. So because of that, again, I think that's the danger, is that we grow cold, we grow indifferent to a lot of things, and we grow comfortable with a lot of things that should still excite us and move us. Now, I'm not talking about fake emotionalism or anything like that. I just simply mean that we should be motivated by our love for God in our worship, in our coming together to worship as a church, and singing the songs that we sing and doing the different services in the church that we do. All of it should be done and directed towards a love for God and out of a pure and a clean motive. So with that being said, here we see now as Jesus is moving and journeying around that in his hometown, it says that he wasn't really able to do anything. Now, when it says that he wasn't or that he did not many mighty works there, it wasn't because he lacked the ability or the power. It's just that he didn't do it because of their unbelief, because it fell on deaf ears there to a certain extent. And so when we pick up in chapter 14, there's kind of a change of topic, and then at the end of this first story, Jesus leaves and moves from where he's at to another place, and we see what's probably one of the more famous miracles that Jesus did. It's recorded in all 4 of the Gospels where he feeds the 5,000, and so we'll try to get that far today. Don't know how good we'll do at it, but we'll give it a shot. So with that being said, like I say, the first 13 verses here in chapter 14 deal with Herod and what goes on with John the Baptist, and it's kind of a little short story inserted here in the middle to kind of fill us in on what's going on in the life of Jesus and surrounding the life of Jesus and that kind of thing, of course. So we'll just dig into it here and make comments as we go through. So let's go ahead and read those first 2 verses to set this up in chapter 14.
At the time, Herod the
Tetrarch,
Close enough.
heard the fame of Jesus.
and said unto his servants, This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him.
Okay. Now, it says here, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch, and I don't know if that's correct or not, but we'll just go with it. But anyway, this was Herod Antipas, okay? This would have been the son of Herod the Great, and if you remember from when Jesus was born, Herod the Great was the one that went to have Jesus killed. The wise men came to him, they said, hey, or he told them, he said, tell me where this baby is so I can go and worship him.
Is he the one that was eaten by worms?
Yeah, and so he was, he obviously was not interested in worshiping Jesus. He wanted to kill him, and subsequently, because the wise men did not come back and tell him where Jesus was, he just went ahead and made it where they killed all of the male children in all of Bethlehem under 2 years old. Yes, ma'am.
I remember studying in my school that was not the first time he ever killed his innocent babies. In fact, he did have a wife and 2 sons, and he had them murdered too.
Right, and of course, just to understand, in the Roman government, there was vast corruption. There was all sorts of debauchery and issues and problems and people that were power hungry, and it continued to degrade over time. It actually got worse after Jesus was resurrected, and as the Roman Empire began to collapse, you have a lot of emperors that were only in power a few months or a few years before they were executed or assassinated. There was a lot of changeover, and so yes, we've heard the word said before, and I think it's pretty much true that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and so to have that kind of power and wield that kind of authority, very few people handled that responsibly and with a good heart and kind nature. Most of the time it went to their head. They loved the power, and any threat, even if it came from within their own family, any perceived threat was dealt with in very harsh terms. Kim Jong-un is a prime example of that in North Korea, where he's had members of his own family killed because he was afraid that they were a threat to his power. Same thing, no different today than it was back then. But Herod the Great died, and this is one of his sons. And just to understand, there's a lot of tangling of all of these people here in this family. It was not a time where a lot of the laws of God were followed, for sure, and so we'll take a look at that. But just know now, because up until this point, we know John is in prison. So the first 2 verses of this kind of leave us at a loss if we don't know what the following verses said. But now it's going to fill in the information, because now it says at this time, now when Jesus was in his own country, and he couldn't do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. It says at that time, this Herod Antipas, or the Tetrarch, heard of the fame of Jesus, Okay, because again, he had been going around and doing all of these miracles. Now listen to this. And said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead. Okay, now obviously the first thing you think was, well, where's John the Baptist? You know, he was in prison last time. Well, it's going to fill that story in. And it says, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. And it kind of gives you a little glimpse into Herod's mind at this point in time. He is like, I think, a lot of people are today. They have a lot of odd and peculiar beliefs that surround Christianity. There's been, at least in this country, enough spreading of the gospel and preaching of the Bible, whether it be good or bad in its form, to where a lot, I don't say everybody, but most people at least have a little bit of understanding of portions or pieces of the Bible. Okay? And because of that, you get all sorts of weird and odd beliefs, you know. And of course you hear people a lot of times, they'll say, well, I just believe that, and then they'll give some statement that's not based on anything but just the way that they wished that it was,
If you get jigsaw pieces from 6 different puzzles and try and put them together.
Exactly,
Sensible.
Right.
Sure.
And so you get people that say things like, well, I just believe if you try to do good to everybody that you meet, and and you pick up strangers on the side of the road, I just believe that God will appreciate that, and we'll all get to go to heaven because of it. It gets from there all the way to, well, I just believe that so-and-so that passed away 6 years ago, I just think that they worked all that out for us today.
And most of them do not believe in hell.
Yeah.
Yeah, at all.
Yeah, or if they do, it's only for people like Hitler and Donald Trump. But anyway, but all of that, that's just a joke, sort of. But yeah, you're right. You get all kinds of weird ideas. I mean, it's fill in the blank. Like I say, you hear all sorts of stories about that kind of thing, and it's because these people have no real compass or basis for truth. Again, a lot of people have superstition. There's people that deal in the astrology thing, and they believe that the stars, all kinds of things on a huge spectrum of how people process and deal with things. But it does show that John the Baptist had gained enough notoriety and had enough pull and influence that even Herod, who was obviously not a believer in the God of the Bible, at least understood that there was some sort of power bigger than just John the Baptist. And of course, he would have been correct in that. But beyond that, I don't think he had very much understanding. Again, they would have worshipped a plethora of gods, and to him it would have just seemed as another, one of many superior powers in the universe.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Herod the descendant of Esau?
Now that I couldn't tell you. I have not studied that far enough out. I mean, yeah, no, it's okay. I don't know. The Bible doesn't do much in the way of tracing the bloodline of anyone but the Messiah, and so I don't know. There may be some speculation, and there may be, in a spiritual sense, those that are lost and those that are on the way and the road to hell. In a spiritual sense, are the children of Esau. Now, not in a physical sense necessarily, but that even was supposed to be a lesson for the nation of Israel. It was that it was spiritual and not physical. Being of the physical seed of Abraham didn't make you saved, for lack of a better term. Being the spiritual seed of Abraham makes you a believer and an individual that is saved and So just understand, because even Jesus said that everyone that says they're a Jew is not a Jew, or Paul said that, in Galatians. But just understand, so he would have had all kinds of different beliefs and ideas, but I just want you to see where his mindset is, and then we're going to see why. Okay? Because Herod at least knew and understood that John had some sort of influence and power beyond the human realm. Okay? And I think that statement right here, that it kind of bothered Herod when he heard of Jesus and his fame and said, this has got to be John the Baptist risen from the dead. Why would he make a statement like that?
He feared.
Yeah, there seemed to be some really deep concern on Herod's part about this, and we're fixing to see why. So the story is back told from verse 3 and following now as to why Herod makes this statement. So let's go ahead and we'll read verses 3, 4, and 5 and start to put that story together.
For Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for Herodias' sake, and his brother's Philip's wife.
For John said unto him, It is not lawful for thee to have her.
Mm-hmm.
And when he would have put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet.
Okay. So here's what happened to John. Now we already know from a previous chapter that John was in prison. Well, here's why. Okay. Herod Antipas, had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for Herodias' sake. Well, who's Herodias? Well, it's his brother Philip's wife, but we'll see there's more to the story than this as we start to fill in these pieces. Why? Simply because John said unto him, It is not lawful for thee to have her. And when he would have put him to death, Herod was mad enough and was going to put him to death. It says that he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. Now, here's what happened. Okay, Herod had John arrested and put in prison. Would have had him killed at that time. Here's why. John the Baptist out and out told Herod, it is not right for you to have Herodias to be your wife. Okay? Why? Well, it was his brother Philip's wife. Okay? That's a good reason right there. The other reason was that Herod would have been her uncle. Okay? But if it makes you feel any better, and I don't know that it should, Philip was also her uncle.
That's not.
Okay? So that's why I say this is all tangled up into some...
I'm with John on this one.
Yeah, so see, and I know I could make a joke about Alabama, but here's the bottom line. Here's the thing that I do want you to take away from this. John the Baptist, and of course we know from the statements that he made earlier that were recorded in the Gospels, John the Baptist was not one to sugarcoat the truth. Okay? And we see here in this case as well, John still stood on truth and principle, even though it was bad for John. Okay? John lived in a time where if you spoke out against those that were in authority, and especially someone like Herod, who was not the emperor of Rome, but he was very, very much in charge of that area, they had every right, as far as their government was concerned, to put you to death. Yeah, and so just understand, John knew what he was doing when he said, look, Herod, it's not lawful for you to do what you're doing. The law of God prohibits on quite a few different levels here, okay? Because obviously it was adulterous, but then it was also incestuous. So we've got a mighty tangled web here. But this is, again, this was not uncommon for the Romans in that day. It was a society that was very much okay with pretty much anything when it came to to sexual matters and that kind of thing.
Seems familiar.
And yes, you could draw many parallels to our time today, to where it had been basically just turned into an activity like any other, that was to be out in the open. And again, I won't go into any kind of graphic detail because it's not necessary. Just understand any form, any perversion, it was all being practiced then with men, women, animals. I know, it's like I say. And again, we're headed rapidly back towards that in today's time. But John was willing, and this is the point that I want to make here. John was willing, in spite of what the culture said, in spite of what was going to happen to him, to stand on truth and on principle and say, it's still wrong here. And in a day when a lot, and I mean a lot, of quote-unquote Christian pastors and leaders have been willing to capitulate to the modern thinking, it's still necessary to stand on principle and on truth. Now, with that being said, and I always try to do this when I bring this up, there is also a wrong spirit in which some of these that stand on the truth conduct and handle it. Okay? It's John simply said, it's not lawful for you to have them. Okay? He did not, try to come up with a riot or, do physical harm, that kind of thing. And so there is a proper way in which we deal with this. All of these things, adultery, fornication, all of these things are wrong. We need to say they're wrong. We need to identify them as wrong. But we also still need to make sure that the people understand and know that if you're willing, just like any of us, to put down your pride and to put down your self-righteousness and see yourself for a sinner and humble yourself before God and ask for His forgiveness, that there's forgiveness to be had. No one is beyond being able to do that. And so there's teachings that those that have gone into these alternative lifestyles and stuff like that are beyond salvation. I don't believe that. I think anybody and everybody that wants to can be saved. And if they'll lay it down and ask God's forgiveness and seek Him, He'll forgive them and He'll cleanse them. That's just, Paul said in Corinthians and listed all of these horrible sexual sins, the effeminate, fornicators, everything on the spectrum. And he said to the Corinthians, he said, and such were some of you. So some of those members in that church had formerly been of that lifestyle, and God had saved them out of that. Now, the idea there from Paul was that no, you don't continue to live in that. You've been saved for a reason and a purpose. Yeah, he said you were. But the idea there is that God could still save those that were like that. And so just understand, there needs to be a balance. We still need to stand for truth. We can't, telling them that what they're doing is okay and that God is fine with it is not a loving way of handling it. It may seem like it, but lying to them is just as hateful and mean as telling them the truth. Okay? More so, because it gives them a false sense of security. It's just the truth. So understand, John was willing to stand up for what was right, not in an obnoxious way, but just in a truthful and a matter-of-fact way. When pressed on the issue, John was not willing to say, well, it's really okay, to save his own skin or to keep himself out of trouble. John said it was not lawful for thee to have her. I'm sure probably, if I had to guess, somebody probably asked John about that. That's how they usually do it, if you've noticed. Somebody presses somebody on, well, what do you think about this? Some hot button issue. And they make them go on the record as to what they want them to say. And so just, I don't know, but that may have been how it happened. John may have just been simply preaching like he normally did and brought it up. Either way, he stood on principle and he stood on truth. And he said, it's not lawful for you to have her. And it says, and when he would have put him to death, talking about Herod would have put John to death, he did fear the multitude because they counted John as a prophet. They knew John was special. They knew that the abilities and the things that John was saying and doing came from God, and the people of Israel counted him as a prophet. And if you remember, many of the men of Israel went out to John in the wilderness and were baptized of him and in Jordan, and John had a huge ministry and a huge following, paving the way for Jesus. And as Jesus came on the scene, John pointed to Jesus and said, you follow him now. He's the Messiah. He's the one I told you was coming. This is the Lord. This is him. This is, John said those things and told the people to follow him. And so now we see here, this is what John has been going on in John's life. So now we know John was put in prison for this. So what happened to John? All right, well, here's the story right here. So let's go 6, 7, and 8.
But when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod.
Whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask.
And she, being before instructed of her mother, said, give me here John the Baptist's head in a charger.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Now, this is what happened to John. Okay. It says, but when Herod's birthday was kept or celebrated. Okay. It says the daughter of Herodias danced before them. Her name was Salome, S-O-L-O-M-E, or Salome, if you want, or salami, if you like preserved meats.
I've listened to a Bitches and Odyssey episode about it, and she's like a teenage girl, and her mother Herodias, she was not very pleasant in the dramatization.
Right, and it appears that neither one of them were too pleasant as people, but from the story we get, again, these are pagan people. We really should expect no different, but it's just the Bible here is just accurately recording what happened to John.
It's not condoning.
Yeah. No, and I do want you to notice here, okay, because it is important to mention that though God does save out of horrible situations, and God does do miraculous things. Jesus was walking the earth doing many, many, many miracles at this time. God never guarantees a miracle to save us from our physical circumstances. And I think John the Baptist here is a prime example, because Jesus himself said there's none greater born of a woman than John the Baptist. And yet John didn't get a miracle. John was put to death and executed here just simply for standing for truth's sake. It's not guaranteed. It's not promised that God will preserve the life of everyone who serves him. Many of the disciples, many of those that preach the gospel in different places around the world wind up being killed for their faith. There were many martyrs in the first century. There's been many more since then. There's been more people martyred, the statisticians say, in the last 100 years than there were in the previous 1900 before that. Understand that it's not guaranteed that God will physically save us from our temporal circumstances. Now, with that being said, I'm sure John the Baptist is just fine with it now. Okay? God honors those that serve him, and I'm sure that John the Baptist would tell you that if he had it to do all over again, he wouldn't have backed down, and he wouldn't have done anything different to save his own skin. He did what was right, and he upheld the truth, and he went to his death knowing that he had done that. But just understand, when his birthday was kept, Herod's, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Okay? First century men were exactly like 21st century men. Okay? Just the truth, okay? This lady danced in front of Herod, and the Bible says that it pleased Herod. Okay? Just going to leave that laying there, but I'm just telling you, just understand it's always been the same. Okay? The strongest instinct that God placed into the animal kingdom is the need to reproduce. It's the truth. That's what they are constantly striving for. And the strongest need that God placed physically in the human world is for men, is for reproduction. It's the truth. Okay? Just being honest here. It gets a lot of them in trouble. And if you cannot, as a man, learn how to control that and to use it in a godly manner, then the world and Satan will use it in an ungodly manner. And again, we see all around us in this country, it's very evident that type of thing is what's used in marketing. It's what's used in
Every.
it is, our society is absolutely saturated with it. The pornographic industry is a multi-billion dollar, and I mean multi-billion dollar industry.
One of the most single profitable industries.
Yes, and there is an out and out epidemic in this country, and it is absolutely consuming men. And it absolutely ruins relationships, it ruins marriages, it ruins lives of those. It is an addiction as much as any opiate drug or any other thing like that is. Just understand, and it would absolutely amaze you if God rolled back the curtain and let us see just who was caught up and involved in it. I'll promise you it would. It would take down more leaders and more people than you can possibly imagine, even in the church world. Because it is an absolute epidemic in our society. And there is no room, understand, just like John the Baptist said here, there's no room for real Christians who want to stand on truth and principle to do anything other than condemn it for what it is. It is wrong, it is evil, and it is wicked, and it is not for the Christian man to partake in. So that's the stand that we as Christians should have on it. And again, God can help us, God can save us from our sins, God can help us deal with those sins after we're saved, and we should use and fall upon His strength to do that. But this was the same thing that was happening back then. Okay? And because of that, and again, remember, this is a man here, he said that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked of him. And in another gospel that records this same story, Herod says that he'll give her anything up and to half of his kingdom. That's a lot. Just understand, that's the way that the male brain thinks. It's just the truth. And Herod here is displaying full-on humanity. Lost humanity. Okay? Because he's fixing to make a horrible decision based on those emotions. And it says, and she was not innocent in this at all, being before instructed of her mother, who also was not innocent in this. Her mother, in fact, probably hated John the Baptist more because she was part of this whole thing where John said it's not lawful either.
It just gets way more twisted.
Yeah. And it says that she was instructed of her mother. So when when Herod said, "I'll give you anything you want," her mother had already laid this plan out and said, if he says that to you, you tell him, I want John the Baptist's head in a charger. A charger was a large flat dish like they would serve table fare on, meat, that kind of thing.
So
Yeah, basically, yeah, on a silver platter, if you will. May not have been silver, but it was a platter. Okay? He said she could have up to half the kingdom. This is what anger will do to a person. Think about the monetary gain that she could have had here. She could have said, yeah, I'll take half the kingdom. Vengeance is what she was after. That was all she had. This didn't even really mean anything in the grand scheme of things, but she said, I want John the Baptist's head in a charger. Now let's see the response here. And we'll see the contrast between a godly man and an ungodly man in their response here. Go ahead. 9 through 12.
And the king was sorry, nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given her.
And he sent and beheaded John in prison.
And his head was brought in a charger and given to the damsel, and she brought it to her mother.
And his disciples came and took up the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus.
Okay. It's a sad ending for the life of John the Baptist, one that Jesus said was the greatest born of women. It seems, and this is why we know, and one of the many, many reasons, why we know and can trust the Word of God to be true. Anybody that wrote this story would not have ended it this way. John was supposed to be a hero.
Yeah, it doesn't look good for Christians.
And yet here we see what is almost anticlimactic in the life of John, who was this great minister, who was the one that paved the way, who came in the spirit of Elijah, like the Old Testament prophets had foretold. The forerunner of Jesus, now we see here, was arrested and put in prison. And for some relationship between a king and this woman, he's being put to death for that, of all things. Not for preaching the gospel, for saying that this erroneous marriage was wrong.
Couldn't change anything either.
Yeah, all for that. It almost seems out of place and wrong, but again, I think that's how we know that the Bible is complete and accurate when it comes to these things. But I want you to look at a couple of things here as you think about that. Look at Herod's response. It said, and the king was sorry. I don't think that Herod really wanted to put John to death. I really don't. Mostly because of his fear of the people. But I think he knew that there was something more. And again, I go back to his statements there where he said he thought it was that Jesus was John the Baptist resurrected. But look at how Herod and his actions are shaped not by principle. And that's what I wanted to contrast for you, John the Baptist, who, in spite of all of this, in spite of the fact that he was going to prison, in spite of the fact that it would have probably cost him his life, and ultimately it did, stood on principle. John, as far as Herod was concerned, was a nobody. Really, as far as most of the world was concerned, John was a nobody.
Crazy old dude in the woods.
Exactly. As far as God was concerned, John was an incredible servant and a righteous and a just and a holy and a faithful man. And he stood on principle. And yet Herod, who was supposedly this great and wonderful ruler, has no principle. It says he was sorry, yet for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat.
He saw it.
That's
Getting back at
yeah. He was like, I said it around them, and I'm going to look weak if I don't do what I said I would do. For people's opinion, and this is why I say it's so important, even in this day where the popular thing to do is to capitulate to the norms of our new society. Herod, we see here, is bending to what he wants to do I don't think Herod would have had John killed on his own at this time, but because he didn't want to look bad around others, he had made the oath. It says he commanded it to be given her. And as if it was nothing, it says, and he sent and beheaded John in prison. So he went and grabbed John out of his cell, chopped his head off. And it says, and again, we read over this sometimes and forget how horrible this is, but this is what happened. This is how the heart of man in its lost state sees how things are just okay, and how the heart of man can become normalized to horrible acts and gore and horror. And it's why, and again,
It's sin polluting.
it's a pollution of the heart and the mind. It's why personally I think the scriptures also support it. Paul says to think on things that are good and holy and just. It's why I don't think really for Christians there's much place for bloody, gory horror movies in their heart and in their mind. I just don't think it's appropriate. I think it's stuff that if you put it in your mind and through your eyes, we constantly become desensitized to things, and it becomes less and less impactful. And I think we're living in a day where people are, for the purpose of being desensitized or being given all of this material. And I think to some degree, now a lot of it is just because man is man and always has been, but I think it is why you see more of the mass shootings and the mass killings and the different things like that. It's because people have become desensitized to it, and acts that people formerly maybe would not have committed just because of the horrible thought of it, they now are able, because of being desensitized to it, to do those sorts of things. Yes, ma'am.
I was just thinking about, that kind of made me think of the gladiators, you know, like an ancient Roman Colosseum.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty brutal. I mean, men fighting against men, or animals, and everything. It was a brutal mess.
And it was their entertainment.
Exactly.
That's what it
exactly. And even that, if you look at the progression, okay, it started out with the Olympic Games, feats of strength and that kind of thing. And by the end, it degraded through, yes, men fighting with men to the death, all the way down to the whole family came out today so that we could watch them feed Christians to the lions. That's how far it went. You brought your wife and your kids, and you sat down and you got your popcorn. Don't know that they had that back then. Okay. I actually did know that they didn't have that back then. But you brought your whole family so that you could watch as men and women, boys and girls were fed alive to the lions, and that was your entertainment.
One detail I'd like to add is even the emperor makes decisions, the life or death of the champion. He either stand up and gives them a thumbs up for life or a thumbs down for death.
Right, and again, the point being that they had become so desensitized to it that death literally meant nothing to them. Cruelty meant nothing to them. Horror meant nothing to them. And they laughed and enjoyed the pain and the torture of others.
And it shows us in this verse right here.
Yeah, and it kind of brings it out right here, and we see this. And his head was brought to her in a charger and given to the damsel, and she brought it to her mother as if it was no big deal. And then it says here, and his disciples, talking about John the Baptist's disciples, came, took up the body, and buried it, and went and told Jesus. So now, Jesus has been told, and we won't have time to go into the story of him feeding the 5,000. But Jesus has now just been told, hey, John the Baptist was just beheaded in prison. Now, I'm sure Jesus already knew that, but just understand, as a human, in a physical sense, Jesus still experienced the human emotions and the things that we as human beings experience, though he was God. I'm sure this affected Jesus in an emotional sense, and it says, I'll just read it to you in verse 13, that when Jesus heard of it, he departed and went in a ship. Ultimately, to go on to continue preaching and teaching to the multitudes. And it shows that even in the event of tragic loss, even in the event of horrible things happening, we must still continue to do what we're supposed to do and move on and be faithful. And we see here Jesus keeping the focus, the main focus, and the compassion and care of others, as it talks about the fact there that as he looked on the multitude, he was moved with compassion. We'll look at all of it next week. We still see the heart of Jesus is towards the ministry of, or ministry to the lost and to the world. And so we'll get into that next week. So again, I know kind of a tough story to look at, but again, it's reality. And we read over it sometimes and forget that John the Baptist had to go through that and had to live that, just simply for being truthful and honest about the Word of God. So, all right, I'm done. Thank y'all for being here.